Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about history, culture, society in general, in this snowy land that we call Canada. And once in a while, we have on the show particularly enjoyable guests, including today, where my guest is a native of Winnipeg and one who has written, edited, and directed films for over 40 years, including After the Big One, Nuclear War on the Prairies, as well as Shameless Propaganda. Always fascinated by history, our guest was led to the book we are discussing today, Unsettled, Lord Selkirk's Scottish Colonists, by his own personal connection to the Red River settlers. He and his wife now divide their time between Winnipeg and Victoria. I'm happy to have on the show Robert Lower. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, for people who might not be aware of what the actual book Unsettled is, can you give a brief description?
Yeah, it's the story of the first 3 years of the Selkirk settlers, who were the original permanent, the very first group of permanent European settlers in west of the Great Lakes. It's the story of their first 3 years, 1813 to 1816, told in a very what a reviewer called immersive style, told as close as I could get to putting you there at the time.
So, one of the things that I find particularly interesting is actually right at the start of your book, although the entire book is very interesting to read, and I really like that description of immersive because I definitely felt that. And you mentioned at the start that when people think of the Red River settlement or the Selkirk settlers in general, they tend to think of big events like the Battle of Seven Oaks, for example. And I'm just going to read a passage here at the start before asking my next question, because I think it's an important passage, where you say, "To be clear, Seven Oaks was no part of the reason why I wrote this book. I wrote this book because I discovered the story that had been missing from those dry historical accounts. And that story makes Seven Oaks and other events a far more interesting and complex event than its reduction to a fight between good guys and bad guys could ever convey." So can you speak a little bit more as to what your intention was with this book and what you were hoping to accomplish in exploring this particular period?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the origin story of the book. I was in the archives going through these papers that have been gone through many times by many historians in the past, and from which they have, from which they've constructed, I guess, précis or descriptions of what happened, but never. What I discovered was that I opened the archives, I guess I would say, at a page of one of of a journal written by one of the officers of the settlers, and I just discovered life. It just jumped out at me. They were in the middle of a rough part of a river one of the rivers leading from Hudson Bay to Lake Winnipeg. They were having trouble with their boats, and it just gushed life. And I said, "Wow! I had no idea that this existed. This lively at the moment record of what was going on." So I did some more exploring, and found that there were about 3,000 pages of journals and letters and things that were now, and I said, this is so much more alive than any account I've ever read of this period. Somebody has to write this. But I mean, I retired as a filmmaker, and I'm not a book writer. I'm a film writer, but not a book writer. And I didn't want to get into a big project, because big projects can have a way of beating you up. But the more I looked at it, the more I said, this is a really good story. And I've been looking for really good stories all my life. I could not ignore it. So I decided I will start gathering this material. And if it comes out to a book, it comes out to a book. Now start gathering this material is the big difference between me and every other historian. In their archives can be quite chaotic because they are kept in the order in which they're donated. So these journals were broken up and scattered all through the archives. And in the past, it would have been an insuperable obstacle trying to work with them constantly, shuffling paper or running microfilm would have been impossible. It is not their fault that this story hadn't been told like this. Now you can capture every page you want to and take it home with you on a little stick and reassemble it at home and work with it as much as you want. And that was just, I realized that I was the first person to notice this, that there was a story in here that could be taken home. And if I didn't do it, somebody would, and somebody else would. And I recognized it for the really good story it was. I mean, I might have run across 5 really good stories in my career, and this was one of them. And so I said, okay, I'm going to start in on this. I put a quote across the top of my screen that says, "You are not required to complete your task. Neither are you permitted to desist from it." So I said, okay, I'm not required, but I got to go as long as I can go. And about a year and a half later, there was a draft.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I really like that mention that you made of the difficulty of archive work in Canada, and just in general, right? Because so much of it hasn't been digitized. And it's something that still today in 2020, despite the hundreds of years of archives that we have here in Canada, I remember having this discussion with my supervisor about this, where she's like, you can still get a great amount of funding just because you mentioned that you want to do archive work, because there's so much left to be done. And I think it's absolutely a valuable project that, works like yours make accessible to the wider audience. And like you say, there's so many interesting stories that are just gathering dust in libraries sometimes, right? Because people haven't taken the time to do it. So I really appreciate that focus that you mentioned in that particular answer.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there may be a whole field opening them up for people re-examining archives for their life and blood.
For
And
sure.
I don't think people connect with their history unless they hear a story with life and blood in it. And Canadian history has a terrible reputation, unjustly, but it's partly because of that. You get a sort of third-person distant description you don't get to really experience the angst that almost all of history is.
This kind of interesting leads me to the next question that I have. So the title is very evocative in this sense. So you refer in this case to a battle, right? The battle for Canada's West, 1813 to 1816. That's part of the title. And I would like you to, elaborate a little bit more as to what you're referring to in the sense when you're talking about a battle, because battle can mean many things. It can be a struggle, it can be an actual physical battle. So can you delve a little bit more into what battle you're exactly talking about in this book?
Yeah, the word battle, by the way, now we get into editors and publishers. I had a really excellent editor who saved my life on this book, because as a filmmaker, I had a certain approach to a story, and when she read the draft, she basically said, "Great story. It's unreadable in its present form." To which I responded, "This woman doesn't know how to make a film." But it turned out she did know how to write a book, and she saved me. So I just want to preface it with that. But the choice of the word battle in the subtitle was a very conscious one. I sort of said, well, battle. I mean, this isn't the American West. It isn't typified by as nearly as much violence or overt violence. And I probably would have used the word struggle, but she said, battle's got guts. Battle sells books. the same reason the word Scottish is in that. Scottish sells books.
Absolutely.
So that's where that particular choice of words comes from. But what it refers to is the sort of four-sided struggle that went on for a number of years in the Western Prairie, especially this side of the Rockies, between the Hudson Bay Company as a fur trading empire, the Northwest Company as a minor, well, not minor, but I mean as a junior participant, trying their very best to outcompete the Hudson Bay Company and take over the fur trade. And then the indigenous participants, on half of whom worked for the fur trade, and half of whom, not half of whom, one segment of whom, the people later called Métis, worked for the fur trade, and of course the other segment being the First Nations, who supplied a great deal of the fur trade. And in sometimes subtle and sometimes very brutal ways, these four column stakeholders were jockeying for position in the West, not necessarily all against each other, but in alliance with or in competition with someone else. And the final element of that was the settlers arriving. And of course, we know who won that struggle, and how the many crimes that were committed in the winning of that struggle, and the many atrocities committed, short and long term. But at that time, the struggle was between those three groups, and it wasn't it wasn't a bloody struggle. There was not a lot of violence associated with the fur trade, although there was some. But with this, it took on a whole new cast. So that's where that comes from.
Interesting. And we'll talk about the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company a little bit later and how they interacted. But before that, I want to get a bit more deeply into the actual content of the book. So you focus on four parts in particular in this book. So we often hear, obviously, about Lord Selkirk, who's on the title of the book, of course. But you don't really focus on Selkirk himself. You focus on who you call in the different parts: the Earl, Miles MacDonald, Colin Robertson, and Robert Semple specifically, and each have their own parts divided up into chapters. So can you tell us a little bit more, first of all, maybe a little bit about who these people are and why you decided to focus on them in particular in this book?
Yeah, that was less a decision than a necessity rising out of the material. They wrote the journals, is the short answer. Selkirk was never here in this period. He didn't come for the first time until 1817, so he hadn't seen Red River or anything else. And because this was immersive, because we were with the events that were happening, the only time he enters is when he sends his annual letters. And we find out what he's thinking back in the family seat of Kirkcudbright, Scotland. The people he appointed were those other three people. Well, he didn't appoint Colin Robertson. That's a whole other part of the story. But he appointed Miles MacDonald. How are you pronouncing that? Are you pronouncing it MacDonald or MacDonald? MacDonald.
I pronounce MacDonald, but I might be wrong in this case.
No,
I really don't know.
I think you're technically right, but in Winnipeg it is universally pronounced MacDonald, which is handy if you also have McDonald's with a D. You know, it's kind of handy that way. But so I'll probably call him MacDonald. But I think technically you're probably right. So right. Pronounce it however you like. Pronounce any of the names however you like. We're all guessing. Is it McKay? Is it Mackay? Is it Mackey? You know, Scots names. So anyway, he appointed MacDonald, and after MacDonald left the colony, he appointed Robert Semple, and those were the two principal. So the names of the parts like chapter heads are to help you feel where you are in the story, give a cast to the story, give a sense that you're working your way through the story. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons you use parts or chapters. Those 4 parts were to say these are the people who are principally making the critical decisions. So Selkirk, of course, he engineered the land grant that I say in air quotes that the Hudson Bay Company gave him. He financed the trip and the people going over there. So until they were in place, he was the man most affecting their lives. Miles McDonnell was the man he appointed governor. So he was making the crucial decisions. And then when he was forced away, Colin Robertson stepped in of his own volition to try to keep the colony going until another governor arrived, and that governor was Robert Semple. So they are the principal decision makers of each stage of the story. The story is also told through the journals of their of the officers who were who were one rank beneath them. Everybody of that rank kept journals in those days. They were work product. They were to be given to the person who followed you, so they knew a lot more about what was going on where you are. So they were all required to keep journals, and I would have loved to have told it from the point of view of my great grandfather, the millwright, or one or more of the settlers. But the settlers are pretty quiet in this whole thing. They sent letters back. We have I think 1 or 2 of those, and we don't hear much directly from the settlers. We hear them reported in the journals of the officers, but it was of necessity. I went through the officers' journals.
Well, that's interesting. That's one of the limitations that I was thinking of as I was reading your text, is like, there's been since the 70s and 80s a lot of interest in the world of historiography and history to, focus more on what we call social history, which is to say less on the people in charge, right, as you did, and more on, as much as possible, the general population, right, or the settlers, right, such as your relative in this case, which I feel is very important and an interesting move, but again, pointing to limitations that we have here in Canada, I think, rather specifically, that you don't necessarily always see elsewhere, is exactly the impossibility of this. And while it does shape the narrative in very interesting ways, and it still creates a very interesting narrative, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you tried to balance these limitations as you were writing, if that's something that you even considered or tried to adapt for.
Okay, that's a good one, because I always wanted to. I set myself. Okay, I set myself some parameters, and the big one was don't leave the material. Don't start speculating. Don't bring in secondary writers and what they might have thought of this. Don't leave the material. Stay in the moment, and that's filmmaking, right? That's what you try to do when you're making films. And so that came naturally to me. But I was aware when I started collecting the material, I hoped there would be material from the settlers too, but there was so little. But it was still a great story. So I said, yeah, I'm going ahead, even if it is just these guys, most of whom are not competent to the jobs they're performing, and which is good. I mean, it makes for a good story, because then you can comment on it. How bad a decision was this, or how bad this decision is will be evident in a few pages or something. But I tried also not to do too much of that. Stay in the time, stay in the material, stay with the people as it happens, and don't foreshadow any more than you can't resist foreshadowing. And but so one of the things I had to do was say, where are the settlers in this? So anytime I had an indication of where the settlers were, I would bring it in. I would. So that's why I mention frequently the parties that included the settlers, the games that included the settlers, the little details like babies being born, people being married, to keep them in the narrative, and every once in a while point out that it isn't my fault. These people never consult the settlers, right? I don't. They don't. They talk about the people, and it's always the people, and it's very seldom individuals among the people. So I am having to speculate, and again, I wanted to keep speculation within really defensible bounds, so that I wouldn't be exposing my own ignorance or slandering anybody. So I tried to do that where I could, but usually in their by pointing out absence.
Absolutely. And it's always interesting because speculation, I think, has its place, but it almost becomes literature at that point, or it does become a work of literature, which has its value and has
Yeah.
its interest, I think, in the overall understanding of history and Canadian culture. But you're not Rudy Weed, for example. You don't write novels based on history. You're trying to write a history in this case, which I think people should keep in mind when reading certain works like this, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned as well, and it's something that I brought up as well in one of my questions, but you have a personal connection to this particular project. Can you talk a little bit about this personal connection and how it informed both the creation of this project and your research going forward?
Well, there was family talk all my life. Every once in a while, it's amazing to me now that more wasn't made of it. I mean, this is such a significant event in the history of where my family and all of them grew up. All of them are, I mean, both sides of my family are 2 or 3 generations on the prairies. And I don't know why it wasn't a bigger deal, but there was this, we had a relative among me. I'm not sure whether my mother knew, but I know that my sister didn't know. It was a direct, a father, grandfather, or grandfather. So this was just there. I mean, this is so typical of what I was trying to combat in this book. The notion of the idea of a vague notion. Oh, we had a relative among the settlers, and I remember asking once what our relative did, and whoever answered me, I hope it wasn't my mother, who was very historically aware, but whoever answered me said, I don't know, was a groom in the Earl's stables or something. Well, first of all, there weren't any stables, there wasn't any Earl, and he didn't have a groom over here. And in fact, being a millwright is that's a literate and numerate trade, a skill, and a fairly prestigious one at the time. I don't know why they wouldn't know that. They didn't know that. So when the city and the descendants of the Selkirk settlers put up a plaque on Waterfront Drive along the riverbank, I think around 2010, and it's the passenger list of this ship that I tell the story of. And I was looking down it, and I came to this name, Samuel Lamont, Isla, and I knew that one of my families in the back, part of my background is Lamont's, and they came from Isla, and I said, this must be our relative, because none of the others shared a name in my background. And I didn't even know who he was. So I then went online, which you can, that's a wonderful thing now. And I established in very short order that this was my mother's father's mother's father. And that's a great grandfather. And it's a handy way to remember it. And so I said, well, he was millwright, and he was here. He was on the first ship, for heaven's sake, and there were only 100 of them. This is massively more interesting than I was ever given to believe or think. So I went down to the archives. I was scared off on my first attempt by a particularly intimidating archivist, but I went back a year or two later and pressed through and found that he had been mentioned compared to most of the settlers, he's mentioned 6 or 7 times in the journals, maybe 10 times. That's 10 times more than most of them are. So that gave me something. But it was during that I said, "Oh, this goes so far beyond Sam Lamont and so far beyond my connection. This is a story that," and I immediately started feeling the story, and I thought, okay, I'm going to imagine. I'm not going to tell it. That's too much of an invention through Sam's eyes, but I'm going to always put myself in Sam's place as I tell this story. What does he know? What does he not know? But it is not told. It's not told as the voice of Sam Lamont. I want to
No, no, no,
stress
no.
that. Yeah.
But yeah, I do generally get that, and I think that's part of the immersive experience that you were talking about at the start, right? You try to channel it without necessarily inhabiting it, which are
Yeah.
two very different things, right?
Mm,
And
yeah.
I think you did a very good job of balancing that
No,
in
good.
the
Yeah.
writing. Yeah, yeah.
Good.
Um, so getting a bit more deeply, again, coming back to the content of the text in this case, and this is something again that you mentioned at the start. So we're dealing here with the interaction of really many different groups, right? The Nor'westers, as they were called, the HBC, indigenous populations, settlers, Métis, all kinds of people. People, I think, still obviously know of the Hudson's Bay Company. It's ubiquitous, I think, in Canadian history and culture, considering it still exists. But can you say a little bit more about the Northwest Company first? And because it's one of those things that actually a lot of Scottish colonists, like those that you talk about, ended up working with and working for, right? So can you speak a little bit about them and why they were particularly important to the history of Western Canada?
Oh, they were. Oh, yeah. Oh, in some ways, they're more important in the history of Western Canada than the Hudson's Bay Company. I mean, they created an entire people, the
I agree.
Métis. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I will call them Métis in the book. I call them Bois Brûlés because they hadn't adopted the name Métis yet, but I'll call them Métis for ease of um, comprehension. Okay, the Nor'westers. They started out as mostly French Canadian fur traders, Montreal, Quebec fur traders. As time went on, they were bought out or replaced or supplemented by Scottish partners. So it was a largely Scottish, mostly Scottish enterprise by the time we're talking about. They were doing what fur traders had done since the days of Radisson. They were floating the letter of the law to make a buck, and so the Hudson Bay Company tended to concentrate on the north of Canada because that's where the furs were best. Where it's cold is where furs are best, and so this group, they were a disparate group of a number of in the early days, in the late 1600s or hundreds, early 1700s. Mack, the fur trade, the Hudson Bay Territory, we'll call it, the territory west of the Great Lakes, via the Great Lakes and via the south, and they came in under the radar of the Hudson Bay Company and started trading with the southern First Nations. And as that went on, and as the century went on, they got more and more successful, and they combined into first 2 or 3 companies, and finally into this one big sort of conglomerate called the Northwest Company. The individual traders became partners in the Northwest Company, and they didn't use forts. They did establish a couple of forts, but they didn't generally use forts. They used traveling traders who went out to find the furs where the fur traders were, get them before they headed for the Northwest or the Hudson Bay posts, give them convenience and possibly slightly better prices. And the Hudson Bay Company started to notice this and not like this, because the Hudson Bay Company, by a strict letter of law and in their heads, had a monopoly right to trade for furs, as you know, through a charter granted by Charles II in 1670. The Northwest Company had a very strong legal argument coming from Lower Canada. And under the laws of Lower Canada, land that was not being used could, by its owners, could be used by those who were not its owners. Well, I don't think the Hudson Bay Company or anybody else would have called themselves owners of Rupert's Land, but they definitely had the trading monopoly. So that in this case, they weren't using their trading monopoly toward the south. So these people came in and filled a gap. So had it ever gone to court in Britain, I don't know how it would have come out. It never did. I think that they just kept fighting each other, and both of them were making money. So that's what it's all about. So in doing that, they're where the Hudson Bay Company tended to use Scots traders and get their people from the Orkneys and the Hebrides and the Highlands and Ireland. The Northwest Company took their people straight from the St. Lawrence, and virtually all of them were Francophone canoemen and traders, voyageurs. And as they came out here in their hundreds, not small numbers, hundreds, they divided themselves into two, and the ones who brought the trade goods from Montreal to the Lakehead, and then the winterers who took those trade goods and went into the country to trade for furs. Those people ended up staying over the winter, taking Indigenous First Nations women as wives and raising families, and very much integrating themselves with the First Nations that their wives came from, and creating this totally unique meld of cultures that got along with both. I mean, it's an amazing story, and Jean Taillé tells it excellently in the North. The Northwest is our mother, and but yeah, so that was the Northwest Company's contribution to what was going on here, and it's crucial to understand they depended on these people to bring the furs to first Red River, but then farther along to Fort William, which is now Thunder Bay, which was where they were then taken back to Montreal, and the trade goods replenished, and out they went again. So they had a very different style, and it created a whole nation. Well, we'll call it a nation. Yeah.
I think that's one of the elements that I think is important about why you focus on this particular period in your book, right? It's not something that you see particularly often of the origins of the Selkirk settlers. We just kind of, as you were mentioning at first, kind of assume that they eventually arrived and the rest is history type of thing. But this period of 1813 to 1816 is really crucial for the establishment of, as you were saying, these power dynamics and relationships between peoples that would really influence the rest of Canadian history. And I think it's something to really remember, despite the fact that the Northwest Company was eventually subsumed, right, by the Hudson's Bay Company in, I forget which year, but it's something that in this particular moment is really important to remember and is crucial to the story that you're telling overall. Right? I don't know if you had anything to say about that, but I just wanted to mention that that's why it's important.
I mean, the settlers arrived in this extremely important crossroads for the Northwest Company, the forks of the Red River, just at the worst moment they possibly could have. The Northwest Company is fighting for its life, and it's losing. It's going to be subsumed, as you said, by the Hudson Bay Company in just 5 or 6 short, 1821. So, yeah, 5 or 6 short years after this period, and they are desperate not to be, and so they see this as another tactic by the Hudson Bay Company to get in their way and to put roadblocks in the way of their traffic back and forth, and so they see it as a very direct challenge, and it's a life and death challenge for them, and they treat it that way in no uncertain terms.
Yeah. And you mentioned the indigenous populations that were in the area, of course, they would be a major element of the emergence of the Métis, as you were talking about, or the Bois Brûlés, as they were known at the time. But can you speak a little bit more and take us through the roles of indigenous peoples to your story and the story that you tell in general?
Well, it was one of the revelations to me in reading this material was the positive attitude that went back and forth between the settlers, the 150 who happened to be here at any one time, and the First Nations groups. There were Lakota called Assiniboine then. There were Anishinaabe called Ojibwe then, and there were Cree, which we still call Cree, and those. So all those people were in the immediate area of the settlement, and all of them had good relations with the settlement. The reason isn't hard to find when you go into it. They're used to trading with Europeans. They haven't had Europeans have been friendly to them. They haven't had a conflict, many conflicts, except commercial conflicts, with over prices with the Europeans. They saw the settlers as an extension of this, and they knew what settlers were there for. They knew what farms were, and they knew what the intention was, and they saw that as a source of winter food. If the settlement got going, and was producing the kind of grain they hoped to someday, this would be a winter food for the. And they were taking up a very in this first group were taking up a very small amount of real estate, and so that wasn't an issue. Disturbed by these few people, so they had no sense of what might be coming behind them, so they felt no threat from them, and as a result, they were very friendly toward the settlement, and the settlement was friendly back. The poster man for that was Peguis, who is still well remembered in Winnipeg. His name's on bridges and streets, and whereas the other indigenous group, the non-First Nations, were the Bois Brûlés Métis, and they had a very they had no particular argument with they're seen individually. They tend to be friendly and cooperative with the settlers, but overall, they depended very much on the buffalo hunt and the pemmican. The pemmican. I think most people listening to this will know what pemmican is, but it's a preserved version of buffalo stew, and they were very dependent on that. And things started to go bad very quickly when Miles McDonnell, who was worried about starvation among the settlers, put out an edict declaring that pemmican must not be taken out of the area of the Red River without his permission. And of course, where most of them got their pemmican was from the Northwest Port that was at the Red River, Fort Gibraltar. So suddenly, all that pemmican was on paper, belonged to the settlers. Well, that was an unbelievably stupid thing for MacDonnell to have done, and it had the effect of alienating so many people and making it so easy for the Scots, the rich Scots in possession of the Northwest Company, to convince their francophone, mixed heritage, Bois Brûlés employees that these people were out to get them. And in fact, they said, enslave you. They want to destroy your way of life and enslave you. And MacDonnell made that an easy story to sell. And too bad about that for the settlers, although it's great for our story. In the end,
Yeah.
it makes for a great story. But.
Absolutely. I want to shift a little bit the
Mhm.
perspective here and talk a little bit about the legacy or the fallout of what you're talking about in this book. So, in the general way that we imagine the Scottish heritage of Canada, we often imagine it as being relegated to more eastern Canada, right? Nova Scotia. For example, I'm in Montreal, and Scottish symbols are everywhere on its flag, etc., on the buildings. But as we've been talking about here, we can't ignore the fact that the Scottish had an impact on Western Canada, right? Through the settlement of Red River, but also through Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. So, can you speak a little bit more about how you feel the Scots shaped the West and became into what it became today, right? Because I feel it's something that we don't necessarily talk about enough.
I can't add much to that because I'm not very. I mean, you are right. The both the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, well, not their people, but their principals and these settlers were very much were totally Scottish. I mean, there were English involved in each case, but minor. And but I'm not sure how much. I know that Calgary too is full of Scottish names and Scottish street names and Scottish symbols. And Calgary is a Scots town. Banff is a Scots town. Edmonton is not, but and Saskatoon definitely not. Saskatoon can lay claim to an original, like Winnipeg, an original non-European name. But I don't know. I mean, they obviously had a large effect, and it was my Scottish relative went back in 1816, went back to Scotland, stayed there another 20 years, married, had a few children, came back, but he came back to Ontario, and his daughter's son, my grandfather, um, came out to Deloraine, in the town in the south of Manitoba, just in the late 1800s, immediately after as soon as the railway had come through, and the rebellion had been put down in the 1885 rebellion, and many of them did, and there are a lot of Scots names there too. I don't know. I think it's probably because the Scots were never fared well, like the Irish. They never fared well as part of Great Britain. So you see the Irish flooding into the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and Montreal and lots of Quebec with their fellow Roman Catholics, and the Scots had the same. The diaspora is huge. They went everywhere that wasn't Scotland because Scotland was kept impoverished by England, or so they would tell you, and just as Ireland unquestionably was. So and they were very energetic people. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
yeah. So that's about all I can say about that.
it's fine. And this is something that you brought up more towards the beginning, but I want to come back to it. So part of your project was to bring to light something that you feel had been left out of the historical record, namely because of the difficulty of archives, but also just general interest in this seemingly uninteresting moment. Um, but and you also mentioned this through the way that people in your family kind of addressed this distant relative in a bit of an offhanded way. So I would like you to tell me a bit more about how you feel or why you feel this moment was ignored, right, in prior historical looks at Western settlements or early Western settlements. Because yes, there's an archival perspective, but I feel like there could be perhaps more to be said about why we don't necessarily talk about those.
Boy, that is such a big topic. So,
I know.
stop me. It one of the things, well, a principle, absolutely a principal reason for writing this book was to give people lurid images to attach to landmarks in Winnipeg. This is where that happened. This is where that person was. This is, and I can now picture that happening. That was what it was all about. And we have not done anywhere near enough of that. We haven't done anywhere near enough of that compared to the U.S. The U.S. did it because when Hollywood, both when Hollywood was established and in their literature, writers and filmmakers found that such a rich place for stories, and such a and such a well of excitement. And so they mined it and they turned it into those kinds of stories where you have images in your head. I say stagecoach, and any cinephile will picture John Wayne hunkered down in a gully waiting for the Apaches to attack. Anything. We didn't do that, and we didn't do it because we get most of our, because of the size of our population and the dominance of both the U.S. and Britain. So we get our historical senses from them and our historical pictures from them. If I say cowboy, you picture an American cowboy, and although we had our own proportion of cowboys, they didn't do what what we think American cowboys did.
It wasn't the same scale. Yeah.
No, and it wasn't, and there, as far as I know, there were no showdowns on the main street of Carstairs and or Banff, that sort of thing. So we just haven't transferred, and Rudy Wiebe is a great example. Guy Vanderhaeghe, magnificent example of somebody who has done that, and God bless them. And that's exactly what I wanted to contribute to. The Englishman's Boy left me with indelible images of Fort Whoop-Up and the Last Crossing, the screams of the Red River carts crossing the prairies on their ungreased axles, and he painted vivid pictures, and that's what I was trying to do, because I had a friend who said, "I'll read this book because you wrote it, but I've always hated Canadian history." And I said, "Okay, listen, this is Canadian and this is history, but it is not Canadian history the way you're talking about it. And really, Canadian history is not Canadian history, And
right, I get what you mean.
Yeah, it can be so vivid. And I think not making it vivid and relying on other people's images have cost us a sense of our own destiny. I mean, and destiny. Well, I'm speaking historically when I say destiny. So the sense of destiny that these people had, and how that destiny actually played itself out. All of that has to be tracked in detail. There are wonderful stories to be told. The most interesting period in the history of Manitoba, I think, is between the Battle of Seven Oaks and the Riel resistance, the Métis resistance of 1870, when it had no constituted government, and people managed to get along and develop. They didn't. I mean, as soon as there was a lure of money, that all crumbled. But as long as they were just living their lives and living sort of subsistence lives, living on the buffalo hunt and the richness of the Red River Valley soil, they got along, and that is an amazing story. It's anarchy at its best, right? Anarchy meaning no rule, and you got to figure it out for yourselves, and you got to do it without killing each other. And they did that. There's remarkably little violence in that period, and those stories have to be brought to life too. I don't think I'm going to do that, but I hope somebody will, and that's what Guy Vanderhaeghe has done for some southern Saskatchewan, and I think I think that's why we tend to dismiss our history, because it's, as you know, it tends to be constitutional history. When were those laws passed, and when were people allowed to do that, and very important things like when were women allowed to own property, but they just don't, they're incredibly important, and it's good to know when that happened and when the women got to vote. But it's the women who got the vote that are the
It's the
vivid
struggles
stories.
that are
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah.
those,
Hmm.
yes, and those getting inside the heads of some of those suffragists is what people have to do in order to start associating them with their own history. I have this thing that there is only one now, and there has never been anything but one now. And now has always felt exactly like it does right now. And so what I was trying to do here was to take us back into their now and make you realize that they felt like you feel today. If it's a beautiful day outside, they felt the sun. They didn't felt the sun, they feel the sun, right? Because it's now. And now has never departed. It's just we've just we've just things change, but now stays the same. And until you can make that everybody, well, see, I told you it was a big subject. Everybody who has ever worked with original material in an archive
Hmm.
has experienced this sense of transportation. Wow, I am back there right now. I'm reading this document. This person signed it. This, at one point, this was said in front of somebody, and they had to make a decision to sign it. In the Manitoba archives, there's a black line notebook that written by Louis Riel, and it's an amazing thing to be in his presence, right? And there is also the minutes of the Winnipeg General Strike Committee. They're there, and they're all written in pencil because at that point, anyway, they're written in pencil, and the hand changes, and the strike committee is there all the time, and the hand changes, and all these things are written, and you watch the strike go by, and you're there because it's there, right? So that sense of being transported back is what we all have to start feeling. When you watch a really good historical movie, you are transported back. You believe you're there.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we have to do. I'm not getting your.
Sorry. I
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm always reminded, and I'll come back to the specifically Canadian connection here, but I'm always reminded of what you're saying, of a quote by sci-fi fantasy author Ursula K. Le Guin, who said that the best science fiction is about right now, even though we imagine it as being part of the future. But the the whole point of literature, and that's one of the reasons why I study literature, and specifically Canadian literature in my own education, is because I feel like the best of it, whether it comes from 150 years ago or it was written last week, right, gives us a sense of the present and exactly what you're talking about, this sense of time as being much more, how can I say, malleable than perhaps we imagine it to be.
Good.
And
Yeah.
I
Good.
absolutely agree with you in that statement. And it's one of the reasons why we started the show in the first place, is to give a sense, to come back to a previous point that you made, that Canadian history is anything but boring, and even less Canadian cultural history, I would say. But
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree with you in this case. For its warts and all, it really is worth delving into, and there's so much more to say about it. And I think people like yourself and historians and cultural theorists are doing a really good job these days of bringing to life a lot of these forgotten elements. But there's still so much work to be done. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I
I
think so.
can't
And
agree more.
I think one of the things we have to overcome is an inherited British tendency to paper things over, be nice, and just yeah, that he was a crook, but we're not going to talk about that because that's ugly. And the Americans wallow in their warts, and I think we should wallow in our warts. you know,
Absolutely, I agree.
yeah.
Um, so, actually, speaking of warts in this case, um, can you speak a little bit? And again, this is perhaps a very broad question, but I feel like there's a way that we can address it in a very specific way. But Um, can you succinctly explain like how you feel your book addresses issues of power and privilege in the context of land ownership? Because that's a major element of the Red River settlement, right? Is the idea of laying claim to the land, right? And you were talking about how, you know, that led to conflicts between the Northwesterners and the Nor'westers and the HBC, but also, of course, indigenous populations who have been here for thousands of years. So, can you speak a little bit more as to how you try to approach this idea of power and privilege in relation to land? Right.
Oh, you could probably do better than I wasn't aware of approaching it in a sense. I was
Right.
very, very careful in this fraught time. I'm writing a book about settlers that is positive. It's not a book designed to add to the growing literature of atrocity. It was, but neither did I want to whitewash anything. Stick to the documents, and inevitably, again, this was a bit of a surprise. They were very aware of land ownership. Now, the First Nations people weren't. They were very aware of protecting your territory, but you didn't own a territory. You just occupied a territory. However, Selkirk specifically, and then through him his officers, were very keen to put a European notion on the territory that they occupied, not just that it was theirs because they occupied it, and but it was theirs, and nobody else had a right to it, whether they were occupying it or not. That's the European notion, and they had to figure out how to. It was very interesting coming across that with Selkirk saying, you have to tell me who I pay and how much I pay them, and and you have to I don't. Mack, as he's reading this, he doesn't record his reactions to that. I think because it would have qualified as criticism of his lordship, and you don't want that down on paper. But as I said in the book, he's reading this on his way back from York Factory with Pegwas in the boat with him, and there was Indigenous sovereignty personified. A strong, proud chief of a village of well-established people, and him, and and he doesn't. It would be wonderful if he had had a conversation with Pegwas about that, but as far as I know, they didn't have such a conversation, and I am not aware of how that transition was made. I don't know when people started accepting that if I put a fence around this, it's mine. If something you're hunting comes onto that, you need my permission to come after it. That idea
Yeah.
was not, I don't know how that transition is a very interesting one.
It is, and there's a lot of interesting historiography of it, especially considering the nature of such enclosures and private property. You get a lot of that from left perspectives, right, and left
Yes.
historiographies, politically speaking. But from what I've read, that idea really started to emerge in like the 17th century, 16th century type of end of the 16th century, with in England what was known as the enclosures, quite
Yeah.
literally,
Yeah.
right, where lords at sword point cordoned off private property in this
Yeah.
case. And so I think you're right in saying that the European mentality by the 19th century, when we're talking about here, was definitely already there, even if not explicitly stated as such, right? This idea of private property would have, I think, and at least that's my understanding of it, would have been at the back of everyone's mind, or at least in the, how could I say it, in this unconscious part of the way that people interacted with
Yes.
indigenous
Sure.
populations or
Yeah.
with the land. Yeah,
The assumptions
absolutely.
behind them. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because at that very moment, the enclosures were going on, and the end of the commons, and these people had just been the settlers had just been put off their land by an expression of private property,
Yeah,
which to them was absurd. It was they had lived there for generations, and by any First Nations notion of what was your land, that was their land, and And when they rose up and fought against this, Selkirk excuses them by saying, he doesn't say poor fools, but that's just outside the brackets. Poor fools, they were under the impression this was their property. So don't blame them for standing up to the people who wanted to take away from them. Of course it wasn't. And he was very conscious that that property belonged to, and how did it belong to her? The Countess of Sutherland. It belonged to her through through this, first of all, clan and then royal concessions, and what made her special. And nobody, I mean, you couldn't question that without ending up in the French Revolution, and that nobody who had the power to stop it wanted. Anyway, so that's a really good question. That's fundamental to our cultures, and a fundamental difference.
Definitely. But I do nevertheless like your point of saying that despite it not being necessarily something that you wanted to delve into specifically because that wasn't the scope of your book, it does underlie a lot of it. And it is necessarily something that we must acknowledge, and that played a role in the way that people interacted, even if it's not necessarily what you wanted to parse out thoroughly in your book. But I really appreciate your answer in this case. Yeah. Getting into some of the final questions, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. We're already at the hour mark. But can you elaborate on perhaps some of the lessons? Because you were talking about how before a lot of historiography, or even a lot of the way that we understand the past, is about now. So I'm going to bring that back and ask, what kind of lessons do you think can be drawn from this book or your experience with writing this book?
What kind of lessons can be drawn from this? Give me an example of a lesson.
If at all, of course.
Yeah. Well, give me an example of a lesson.
Well, actually, the land relation, I think, is one example, right? The way that people understand different perspectives on land ownership, I think, is a way that we can learn in the present, right? Especially in the wake of reconciliation and the rise of that since, say, the late 90s, for example, right? Because one of the major elements is the fact that Indigenous populations throughout Canada, despite their differences, often have a similar idea of non-private property, right? Which is something that we can consider again today, right? And how the way that the settlers that you're describing and the Indigenous populations that you're talking about interacted has an impact on the way that those interactions take place today, right? That's, I think, the way that I'm imagining lessons, but perhaps.
Okay, well, I get you now. Yeah, and I would say, I guess the principal lesson that might come out of this is examine the facts. Exactly what you're saying. Nothing happened magically. Nothing happened overnight. No settler story is the same as any other settler story. You can't assume that because people were coming over here and expected to stay, that they had the notion of taking away someone else's land, although that is in the end what they did. But you can't assume, you can't dismiss them or demonize them. By the same token, all the criticism now that's going on of John A. Macdonald at first kind of shocked me. I thought he was the one safe symbol we had, but I am being educated. I'm being given lessons by people quoting him in ways I didn't, I hadn't been aware of when they. I still don't agree that he was a physical scourge on the First Nations, but he was a cultural scourge, no doubt about it. And of course he did everything he could to enable the physical scourge. And it's a different way of looking at, a guy who has had a great deal of. So look at, now that we're re-examining our history, re-examine it. Really, that's the lesson. Look closely, and you'll find things you didn't expect, and and it will never fit into cozy assumptions. Whichever side of whatever argument you're on, it won't fit into your cozy assumptions. So that's what I would hope people take away. It's certainly what I learned. Holy moly, isn't this interesting? It's not, I knew what happened, and I didn't know what happened.
Absolutely. And I think that's really beautifully conveyed in the book. So, speaking of conveying elements of the book, is there a particular part of the book that you particularly enjoy? And this is always a place that I like to give the authors that I interview a bit of a chance to read perhaps part of their book so that people can get a sense of it and what perhaps might have interested the author themselves.
Well, yeah. Anytime action is what interests me. Whenever something is changing or something surprised me, I delighted in it, and I wrote it. Now I have a section I can read. It's about 6.5 minutes long. Is that long for you?
No,
but this gets at what I was trying to do, and it sort of sets up the story in a lot of ways. It's right at the beginning of the book. We know why the settlers have left. We know where they're going, and we know that they have left and they've been on the sea. And I think we've gone away to see what is happening at the Forks while they're on their way over. And now we come back to Churchill, Fort Churchill on Hudson Bay in 1813. On an August afternoon, 2 ships appear off the western shore of Hudson Bay. Both are under full sail and running hard for the Churchill River. Sweeping into the river's wide mouth, the ships glide past a disused stone fort and quickly reduce sail. Along the western bank of the river, Hudson's Bay men, as well as some Dene and Inuit hunters, look up, startled, as this dramatic apparition bears down on them. It's not quiet. Men shout orders, sails are reefed, rigging and spars clatter and creak. The bystanders can only stare. These vessels are vastly larger than anything normally seen in this river. The natural reaction is alarm. In the subarctic wilderness, the unexpected is rarely good news. Some spectators recognize the Hudson's Bay Company Prince of Wales, which has been supplying the trade for years. The other, HMS Brazen, is a Royal Navy escort. What are the ships doing here? A ship's arrival is a big event in the life of any remote post, probably the biggest of the year. The short northern summer allows for only 1 or 2 ships most years, and those invariably head for York Factory, the Hudson's Bay Company northern headquarters, 250 kilometers south of Churchill, where these are put in. The Churchill Post log records, late in the afternoon, the Prince of Wales and His Majesty's ship, the Brazen, cast anchor in the river, sent 2 men to fire a salute. The Prince of Wales longboat is eventually lowered into the water, and late in the evening, Captain Turner is rowed ashore, not to greet the traders, but to scout sites for hospital tents. The ship is riddled with deadly typhus. Turner's crew, normally 25, has been reduced to 8 fit for work. Several sailors have died along with 5 passengers, a mixed group of Scots colonists bound for Lord Selkirk's settlement far inland. Informed of the situation, Mr. Topping, chief factor in charge of Churchill, orders that the passengers should remain on the ship. Too late. Passengers and ailing sailors are being disembarked as fast as Captain Turner can manage it. The 90 or so passengers put ashore are mainly Highland farmers. Their ultimate destination, Red River, is deep in the heart of the continent. They range in age from 1 to 65, and half are women and girls. One of them is my great-great-grandfather, Sam Lamont, a 22-year-old millwright contracted to build a mill to grind the colony's grain. They had expected to land at York Factory, where the colony's governor is waiting with small boats to convey them 1,200 kilometers inland. Now they have rocky ground for a bed and sails for a roof. Over half are fevered with typhus. A crossing that had started with so much hope ends as badly as anyone might imagine, short of sinking. Quarantined in the open, kept distant from the Churchill post, neither comfort nor hygiene is possible. 2 weeks later, however, surviving passengers and sailors are taken out of quarantine. But Captain Turner makes the drastic decision not to go on to York Factory. but to head straight back to Britain to avoid being trapped by ice already forming in Hudson Strait. He orders all cargo unloaded and sets about preparing to depart. He has not reckoned with William Auld, Hudson's Bay Company's superintendent of all northern factories. Topping has sent a fast boat to York Fort to warn Auld of Turner's intentions. I immediately embarked on an open boat in the middle of the night, Auld later writes. I got to Churchill in 45 hours, drenched with salt water, the sea breaking over us for 3 to 4 hours without mercy. On September 9th, Auld sweeps into Churchill like the wrath of God. He summons Captain Turner ashore and threatens to replace him as captain. He reports, after some time, Captain Turner consented, and orders were given to reship the cargoes destined to York Factory. The cargo is hauled back aboard, freshwater barrels were filled, and finally, to everyone's great relief, Turner admits 48 of the healthiest colonists back on board. The sick will be kept over winter in Churchill and sent on in the spring. Next morning, both ships hoist anchor and head for the sea, but a strong tide drives the Prince aground. Turner manages to work her loose, but can only return to Sloop's Cove, where he lightens her load, dumping most of his fresh water, one of his heavy anchors, assorted cargo, and, alas, all the would-be colonists. Thus unburdened, the Prince escapes to sea, where she and the HMS Brazen set course for York. The close to 90 Scottish farm folk left behind discovered that Churchill, though glorified with the name fort, is no more than a scatter of ragtag buildings, barely fit to house a few officers and a dozen or so men. There's no shelter for long-term guests, certainly not 90, most of whom are women and minors. The shoreline is rocky and windswept. To winter under tents is unthinkable, yet there are no trees large enough to provide logs for cabins. The prospects are unpromising, and those Arctic breezes lifting their kilts are not getting any warmer.
Thank you very much.
That's a quite edited version of chapter 2 or 3 or whatever chapter it is.
Chapter 2, yeah.
Good.
So one of the last questions that I always like to ask guests is one that I don't send them in advance, but what didn't I ask in this interview? And what's the answer to that question?
You did pretty well, or I did pretty well getting in what I wanted to say. I don't know which it was, but I don't feel like you didn't ask anything that I really wanted to get across. I guess I would add, maybe what you didn't ask was, how did you see yourself in this book? Because I did. I thought carefully about how I was going to enter this book. I've written a lot of narrations for films, and that's a whole art in itself. And you have to be very careful about keeping it. There's an art to keeping yourself out, but keeping your point of view in. And that's what I decided to do. And it's again that now thing. I didn't want anybody to think I was pretending it was 1813. So I wanted to tell you that I was telling this story, and I'm back there in it with you. This is not a work of fiction. It's not a work of speculation. I'm your host and narrator. And I had a lot of first-person pronouns in it. It wasn't one of the things that my editor, Leslie Erickson, told me to take out, but it just came out with her. So I had to keep. I did what I did. I very rarely say I in a narration either. I kept my point of view in there, and it was. I was worried with some of the editing that it was disappearing, and Leslie assured me that it was not, and people have since assured me that it did not. So that's I guess a big question that I asked approaching this. Where am I in this book? I don't want to be the voice of God. I don't want to be impersonal, but at the same time, I don't want it to be my story.
Well, again, I think you navigated that very well, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me today about this very interesting book. Once again, it is called Unsettled, and is it already available in bookstores?
Yes. Yeah, it's in bookstores, yeah. ECW Press, Toronto, yeah. Well, I've enjoyed it very much. I love talking about the book, and generally when I do, my wife is there and she's heard all the stories so many times that I'm embarrassed, right? But she's not here now, so this has been great, just great.
Yeah, Thank you very much. And pick it up. It's great. And support smaller presses like ECW because they're well worth it. They always put out great stuff. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.